Welcome, Francene.
So I'm really grateful that Francene is joining us not only as preacher this morning, because, it's very rare that I hear other people preach. I just have to be honest. And it's really a lovely sermon you're in store for, particularly when you think about I am the bread of life happens 5 weeks in a row. You're in for a treat and a different twist on the scripture this morning. But Francene has done all kinds of things in the diocese, and she has the unqualified support and gratitude and admiration of every cleric I know, because she's just that kind of person. And that's saying something, because priests are hard to please. So this is a fantastic human being. She has done things like helped reorient the discernment process for people who want to be deacons or priests or lay leaders, including the establishment of discovery retreats. She served as the vicar at St. Luke's downtown in Houston. Right now, she's serving in a couple capacities, including the administrative dean of the Iona School. That's the one that Mike Brady went to, so that people can become bivocational priests. Francene herself is a bivocational priest, which means she does this for free in general, God bless her. And the other way she's serving is on one of the committees under Bishop Doyle's vision for racial reconciliation in the diocese. And one of the committees particularly is about the Talbot Grant. So I hope you were able to watch the video Bishop Doyle sent out. It was linked in the e-news. If you haven't seen it, you can always watch it when later, because it's still in the e-news, and we'll send it again. But Francine's going to talk to us briefly, or as long as she'd like, and as long as you've got questions for her about that work. So Francene, I hope I introduced you well enough, and now I'll be quiet.
Now I have to live up to that stuff that you all said. But thank you for allowing me to join you this morning. As Mike indicated, I do sit on this committee. It's called the Committee for Racial Justice, and it's a multiracial committee. So that's I wanted to highlight that it's not all African Americans. It's a multiracial committee, and of members from churches across the diocese. So they're members in Austin and Longview and all over the place. So the committee that I co-chair is called the Talbot Fund. And the Talbot Fund is named after John and Joseph Talbot, who were slaves who helped to build Christ Church in Matagorda. And they were also the first slaves to be baptized at that church. And how that was discovered is that the Talbots, one of the Talbot family members started to do some genealogical research and traced their family members back to Christ Church, Matagorda. So as a result of that, it started some conversation about what have been the relationships or I would say race relations within the Episcopal Church, and how have our churches either helped or hindered that. So that's what's undergirding Bishop Doyle's movement forward for us to talk about, what is our history, what is the church's history in terms of race relations, and then how do we bring that forward in a way that's truthful, respectful, just so that we can all sort of, come clean about, where we are. And part of that is working with churches to either create either community types of conversations, memorials, a variety of different things that could be funded, but they need to be supported and sponsored by an Episcopal church. So the intent is to say, we as the Episcopal Church really do welcome you, right? And so therefore, asking the various churches to come up with ideas that would be visible in the community, but also makes a statement about who we are as Episcopalians as it relates to race relations. So the project that you all are putting forward is to recognize the African Americans who've contributed to the space program, if I'm not mistaken, right? And you've actually had several members of your church who were astronauts who were part of that. I remember Charlie Bolden. I remember Charlie really well. He was head of NASA administration under the Obama administration, but before that, way before that, he was a member here at St. Thomas, as well as there's another gentleman, but I don't know him particularly, but I do know Charlie really well. So it was, how do we recognize that history especially after the movie Hidden Figures came forward, there was a question about, so what are the other stories out there that we don't know? And is there a way that we as the Episcopal Church can contribute? So yours is one of highlighting achievement. There are others where, there are other proposals where there's one proposal right now on the table to do a memorial for what's called the 1919 Project in East Texas, where there was lots of racial unrest, but then the church coming forward to say, how do we make reconciliation around that? So that's another project that's working right now. Now there are other projects under different names. Some of them are supporting scholarships, because in the past we haven't had that many African Americans come forward to be priests in the diocese, primarily because there was not very many places for us to serve. Most of us have been either serving in churches that were either all African American, and there's only 3, I think, in this city. So that makes it a little tough if you wanted to be ordained, because then there would be no place to serve. So if we figured we would increase the number of people who really do have a call, and then slowly start to introduce clergy of color into different churches and congregations. Then there's another fund to help with churches who have had some significant problems with their physical plant, because the congregations have dwindled. And so there's been money set aside to allow them to fix some of the major projects, not small things, not just decoration and paint, but things like sewers and air conditioning that falls out and when it's 100 degrees, so that those congregations can continue to function. So right now in the Diocese of Texas, the first church that was founded for, and I say founded for, African Americans is St. Augustine's in Galveston. It was the first church, and that's because of segregation. We couldn't all worship together. The second one that was founded is St. John's in Tyler. And then the third one is St. Luke the Evangelist, which is in Houston, which is where I was for 10 years. That was founded in 1920. So after that, then churches started to change, and just like in a lot of other places, as the neighborhood changed, and so did the makeup of the church. But those are the 3 churches that were founded specifically for, and I say African Americans, but I should say Black Episcopalians, because so many of them were from the islands that were very, very familiar with the Anglican Church and did not have a place to worship. So anyway, there's some funds that are set aside to put up some memorials, to have some recognition, primarily to promote the conversation and really live into what we say when we say that the Episcopal Church welcomes you. So I think that's, unless there's some questions, I'm happy to answer those.
And if you have questions, you're more than welcome, as always, to put them in the chat, or to just go ahead and ask openly.
I was that thorough, huh?
The question has come up about reparations. How will that work if it comes to that?
So in our diocese, we've not been talking about, if you're specifically talking about like financial reparations, we haven't, that's not where we're headed. It's more around, because I mean, what can you do in the way of money, and who would you give it to, right? Yeah. And so it's more around using the funds that we have to promote, I would say, the building of relationships. What kinds of environments can we create to bring people together, to have safe conversations, to build relationships that are scripturally based? And so we have not used the word reparation in our diocese. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, yes.
Actually, the bishop's phrase that he was very careful to use and uphold at council, which is like the meeting of the diocese, is repairing the breach.
Yeah.
So this has been the talk about, hey, there's been a breach. It's actually affected our endowments, and we've sort of made money off of injustice practices. So the question is, how do we repair that breach?
Right. And the focus remains within the church. So all the activity and all the funding and the programs have to be sponsored by one of our churches. So it's not as if there's going to be funds given to an outside organization unless it is sponsored by one of our own Episcopal churches. So that way we're not giving we're not going to give the impression that we're just going to be handing out funds to any particular group. As a matter of fact, when it was announced that the bishop was doing this, we started receiving application requests from New York and St. Louis, all these other organizations saying, we want some of that. And it's like, well, no, this is specifically for our diocese. And the other thing that I think is important is even though there was a dollar amount that was announced that's being set aside, we're only allowed to use the earnings for that of any particular year for the projects. So it's not like we're sitting here with this huge bucket of money. So if the market tanks, we're going to have to scale back on the projects that we do. But that's to ensure that there's a longer term vision and some longer term funding. So we're not going to be tapping into the corpus.
Francene, would you speak to those dollar amounts for us, just as a reminder?
Yeah, so the total amount is $13 million that was granted by a variety of foundations. And a lot of people want to know, where does the money come from? It didn't come from our assessments, because our assessments were actually dropped as a result of selling of the hospital. But it was primarily from private donations that were given and set aside. And I think for the Talbot Fund, ours is about $2 million, if I'm not mistaken, over a period. And so it's really us having, we're using the earnings from that $2 million. And lately, of course, the market has been doing well. And so we're guessing that in any particular year, we're probably going to have somewhere between $50,000 and $80,000. But we can start a project, and one project can be funded over a period of time. So it's not like it's one shot and you get $30,000. But if it's a longer term project, then we indicate that in the proposal so that we can prepare and be ready to fund those.
So on average, the Talbot, for example, the Talbot endowment, right, which is about $2 million, you're expecting that's going to make about 3% in earnings? Is that?
Well, we're hoping for about 4%.
Okay.
Yeah, we're hoping for about 4%. So that's what we're budgeting against. And if we do run into a problem and we have a very specific project that we really think needs to go forward, then we will go back to the finance department and consider making presentations to some of the other foundations that have not yet contributed to see if they would be willing to offset the difference so as not to get behind in some of the projects. Any other questions?
Some of the other work I think you mentioned and the bishop mentioned as well includes scholarships for seminarians and scholarship for college students as well. Is that right?
Yeah, there's so it's interesting. So our Canterbury's, it's a lot of the money was given to the big schools for their Canterbury, for their student Canterbury's. And at one point there was a Canterbury active at Prairie View A&M, and there was one at Texas Southern, which is where I was. And then Houston Tillotson. So there's been money put aside to actually hire college missioners to go back on those campuses because we had completely let them go. And so there's funding through the mission department to fund for college missions, but also to increase the visibility of the Episcopal Church on those college campuses. We have lots of foreign students from Africa, from the Caribbean, that are Anglicans, and we've never reached out to them. Yeah. So we're doing that in terms of the college. And then for the Seminary of the Southwest, there's the Polly Murray Fund, which is to assist with living expenses for students of color who otherwise would not be able to attend. And one of the first graduates of that program was a member of St. Luke's. I'm really happy about that. She has a MDiv from Princeton, but was not able to be ordained here. So she finally finished her year of Anglican studies at the Seminary of the Southwest under the Polly Murray grant. And she is now assigned to Palmer down by the medical center. Did that answer your question, Mike?
It did. Thank you.
Well, are the programs that you're putting on the college campuses, is that primarily for African-American colleges or for all colleges?
Well, for we've had a visible presence at most of the universities for quite some time. So for example, the big schools like Texas A&M, UT, Sam Houston State, we've had very, very active Canterbury's there. Baylor, we've had them there, and those remain. So these are just in addition to what was already in place. So nothing was taken away from those particular schools because they always had fairly big budgets. I know that the A&M campus was huge. I went there with their Canterbury for a while, and it was very, very active. And so it's reaching out into some of the schools. Now, the one here in Houston, it's interesting, instead of it being attached to one particular school, it's called the Houston Canterbury. And the person who runs that, Charles Graves, he covers University of Houston, Texas Southern, Houston Community College, and U of H downtown. And so he does this whole circle. And then on Sunday evenings, when we could meet in person, they used to meet at St. Luke's, my church. It was on the campus of Texas Southern, and they would have a Sunday evening service. So during the week, he would have Bible study at each of the individual schools. And then on Sunday, bring them all together. So you had a cross university or cross college kind of campus ministry, which was created uniquely for Houston because we're so spread out with so many different schools. But he's done a fairly good job with that. I hope that answered your question.
Well, yes. Is there anything going on at the University of Houston Clear Lake?
Not that I'm aware of, no. There is something going on at the University of Houston, the main campus, but not at University of Houston Clear Lake. That's being funded by the diocese at this point. Good question.
Yeah.
Considering that we're living in this part of Texas where there's huge numbers of Hispanics, are any Hispanic students being served in any way? Or
yeah, exactly. As a matter of fact, the young man who is leading the Houston Canterbury is bilingual. Even though he's African American, he speaks Spanish.
Oh,
And
really?
so there's and he works with San Pedro and San Mateo, the two churches there, to identify if they have students at any of those schools, and then he goes out and targets them as well. Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. But we wanted to make sure that we had someone who was bilingual who could actually reach out to our Latino students.
Thank you.
As a matter of fact, when the Houston Canterbury first started, the very first college missioner, she was also bilingual, and so was her assistant. And so it's been intentional that way.
Okay, thank you.
And I speak a little bit enough to get me in trouble, so.
Thanks for
They want me
trying.
to do it.
So how many people, our churches have been talked, or at least talked about if they haven't already submitted grants? And could you maybe tell us a little bit about the variety of things that people are requesting funds
Well,
for?
it's interesting that most of the grants have been for scholarships. And one of the things I didn't mention, and I forgot, that someone asked about scholarships for students. So for example, if we have a student that is active in one of our Episcopal churches, so they're in a choir, they don't even have to be a member, but if it's a paid singer, one of the musicians, because we do recruit from those schools for our church services, then they are eligible to get a grant or scholarship because of their support in the Episcopal Church. And of course, our hope is that then we can bring them into the church, right? But so we've reached out that way. But in terms of the others, I have to admit, I lost part of your question because of going to redirect it. What was the other part of that? Or you're on mute.
Okay, I was saying, I'm just wondering how many churches have already come up with proposals and what variety of proposals?
Yes, so it's really interesting, and most of the requests have been for scholarships and deferred maintenance. The committee that I chair, we've only seen 3 proposals because that, I think, starts moving into the harder work. So we're going to have to do a little bit more in terms of encouraging people. And there's one church in particular that will remain unnamed. We've been working with them since February to help them become comfortable with, if we sponsor a particular project, how will we engage the community? And it's a small town. And so if you start bringing up issues around race and slavery, some of the families that have been there for years may end up being revealed in that. So it's we have to be really careful. And so it's causing some people to pause about, are we ready to do this or not? So we've only seen 3, and St. Thomas is one of those 3. There's another one in East Texas, and only now, after two of the churches in that city have come together and said, okay, we will both do it together. So that if one church says we're going to do this and members don't like it, they go run to the other Episcopal church. So the 2 priests have said, we're going to collectively, the vestries, we're going to do this together. So that way, we're not playing one against the other. So it's been very, very interesting, but it's the harder work. And so we're trying to be slow and gentle with it as we move people through the process. So only 3 for my committee so far.
So St. Thomas is sort of unique, although we're in a unique position due to our location.
In that we went back to the bishop and said we would like to be able to entertain proposals that recognize achievements, not just the wrongdoings of. So we were able to change the tenor a little bit.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Come on sideways. There we are. Well, I'm happy to join you all again on Zoom if you have any other questions, and as we progress, if there are no other questions.
Well, I was very interested in something you said earlier about the early churches, that the African Americans came from the islands, so they were very familiar with the Anglican Church.
Yeah.
Is that kind of how the African American Episcopal Church grew?
Interesting. Well, my family is originally from South Carolina, which had a huge African American population. But I think what happened is that, we as Episcopalians do not do much evangelism. So the question becomes, how is it that so many African Americans end up being Baptists or Methodists? That's because the Baptists and the Methodists went out to the field to get them, right? And the Episcopalian, the Anglicans didn't do that. But when you were in the islands, there was a very different, I think culturally it was very different, especially those islands settled by England. They were much more quickly incorporated into the religion of the colonists. That wasn't necessarily the case here in the US. And so we were probably more, I'm thinking even my family, we were invited in the Episcopal Church when I was like 17, but that's because the neighborhood had changed. And so they started to do more outreach. And so there's really a huge benefit to actually purposefully extending an invitation, which we're not very good at doing, in our church. We're learning to do it better, but we're not as good as some of the other denominations. And so my family grew up Baptist, and when I was 17, I was introduced to the Episcopal Church. It's like, where have you been all my life? Right? How come I didn't hear about you, right? And so we recognize that we're not as well known as we could be in African American communities. So when people see me and they see a collar, they're like, oh, what? Who are you and what does that mean? And now some other time I'll have to tell you this story about when the Episcopal priest knocked on our door, inviting mom to let her kids come to the youth. She was like, who are you and why are you at my door? I hope that answers part of your question.
Oh, well, yes, then I can assume that that's why there's a strong Anglican presence in South Africa.
Yes, exactly. And Nigeria and Kenya. So if you follow the colonist, you can see, it's very, very prominent.
How about in Asia?
In Asia, I don't think it's as strong. There's a fairly large presence, I understand, in India, but I'm not familiar with, the other parts of Asia.
Well, I was simply thinking about Hong Kong, which for a long time.
Hong Kong, as a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, Hong Kong actually had a woman bishop for a while, I think. if I'm not mistaken.
I think so.
Mhm. So we just follow the colonists, and that's where he. But like I said, we were much more, the Episcopal Church is much more, I would say, reserved, probably the Lutherans as well. But the Methodists is their circuit riders, and the Baptists that would just go out there and then they pull people in. And we didn't do that.
It's funny you mention it, Francine, because a lot of my mentoring rector was, I think, very keen in his observation. A lot of people who have grown up evangelical, particularly Baptist and Methodist, talk about how they do children's programs, like Awana and Vacation Bible School. And the narrative is, in general, like, oh, the Episcopal Church doesn't do children's programming very well. Apples to apples, not so. But he said, well, here's how we do it. We do it through creating the finest schools around. And it was an interesting to say, it's not that we do nothing, it's that we focused our resources on education,
Right.
Through schooling, which I thought was a little bit of an uplift. We still don't do children and youth ministry well in the Episcopal Church, in our churches, but we do schools better than anybody, you know, and
Right.
that was interesting that he made that observation. And part of that, I think, comes through our core commitments and our reticence to kind of push people toward conversion.
Yeah, and but then if you think about how we do schools well, it wasn't until there was like forced integration, you know, desegregation of schools. And so, you know, by then, so who was then the target audience of the school? And it's interesting you say that, because I do mention in the sermon that I went to boarding school, and the service, which is really interesting, was very, very Anglican in its approach. So while I was away at boarding school, I'm learning how to be an Episcopalian without really knowing that that's what I was doing. It's really, really quite interesting.
We actually studied the book last year, or I presented on it anyway, the Gardner Shattuck book, Episcopalians and Race. And having lived in Atlanta, there was this really sad history to a fine school called the Lovett School, which used to be a diocesan school. But when the General Assembly said integration was going to happen in schools, the Bishop of Atlanta told that school to withdraw its Episcopal identity so it could discriminate. So it is on both sides. That was a sad, sad moment. Again, because the Lovett School is a great school, has a fantastic spiritual presence, but was just steeped. I mean, the Episcopal bishop told them to lose their Episcopal identification so they could discriminate.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that, there's a really interesting history about our own St. Stephen's School that's in Austin. And how at the time, I think it was under Bishop Hines, that they moved to integration, and a number of, they lost a number of fairly wealthy donors, but they pushed on, and, you know, thank goodness the school continued to survive. But that was always a big risk, I think, as it is today, even. I hate to say that, but it was a big risk.
Father Mike, do we offer scholarships in our school?
We do, and in fact, you may know this, that we worked really hard over the last year and a half to create some diversity, equity, and inclusion scholarships, to create a pool of monies that goes over and above what we offer financial aid. So the way our school works here is that the maximum financial aid gift you can receive is 50% of tuition. Right, so that's if you qualify, and we vet that through a third-party organization called FAST that looks at your W-2s, et cetera, and makes a recommendation. And we have a committee of people who are kind of anonymous, but also know the family's need over and above the FAST recommendation. But, you know, $5,500, that's half tuition here, still locks some people out. And so we established this pool of monies, and we're still kind of recruiting for it so that we can help students go the rest of the way, with the goal that we'll, you know, include people both economically, religiously, different family circumstances, and of course, like ethnically, racially, who otherwise wouldn't even consider this as an option. So we are sending 2 students through beginning this fall with those monies we've collective.
But I like that you said, Mike, it's just not race-based. It's based on a variety of situations, which I think is really important to keep in mind.
In fact, one of our principal donors, they gave a considerable amount of money with the target of single parent families.
Mhm.
So we have one of those students started, and they'll be that money will be there at least for 5 years. So that'll get them at least through the grade because they're kindergarten this year.
How do we donate to that fund, Mike?
Fantastic. Well, you can do it a couple of ways. One is you can just sort of write a check to the school or church. On the bottom, you can put DEI scholarship. I can get you a meeting with the head of school because some people want to have donor recognition, which we do. I mean, obviously it's double blind, but you're able to see some of the ways that students are progressing, like you're able to see some of their artwork. They'll write you blind thank you notes. They'll get a notification that this is like, I'm going to make this up, but like the Cartchkill Rye Memorial Scholarship that they're receiving, so that they can write you a thank you note. So there's all kinds of levels of this. Again, some are like one time, some are multiple years, some are commitments, and some have name recognition, and some are anonymous. And that's because different people want different things. Do you have any other questions for Francene? She's been so good, not only to preach at 2 services, but to show up in the middle here, which is just exhausting for many folks. And she's so poised and kind to do it.
No, it's well. I have a big E in my Myers-Briggs, so I get energized.
Oh, okay. Well, Francene, I'm really grateful, and I'm going to ask the rest of us, if you'd like, to turn toward the chapter of the book that we read, which obviously is immediately relevant to what we're talking about, because as Professor Wink says in the book, this is what the powers and principalities are all about. So I want to solicit your questions, comments, or affirmation. So if Professor Wink were alive, would you have questions for him? Were there bits in chapter 3 that were kind of light bulb moments for you, or even ones that made you bristle? That's our opening question. Well, I'll do the dangerous thing and go first. I thought it was fascinating, the Bible study that he does that talks about rulers both being defeated and being reconciled. And the way that Professor Wink talks about how there are these powers that divide, that the God is not interested in destroying, but in converting. I thought that was really like an incredible approach that he does, right? So you think about some of these powers are things like ageism and sexism and racism, and how Professor Wink says not just will they be annihilated, they'll be converted. And that's something you just don't normally hear. And thinking about how those forces that are so divisive and strip the creatures of God from their dignity, how Christ can not only stop them from doing that, but convert them so they build up dignity. That's amazing to me. I mean, that's like reading the prophet Isaiah, who talks about the wolf lying down with the lamb, right? Like it's beyond my imagination.
Mm, mm, mm.
He also, for me, has that wonderful line, right? That God is not interested in swapping leaders out who will just more or less participate in the same system, but these powers and principalities represent the systems that are deeper than the face or the person occupying the throne, right? That's the language of the New Testament. Sometimes we can get really caught up in that leader is bad, and forget that that leader is just the face to a system of oppression. Normally, I would settle for change of leaders because it's easy and it's, you know, it's quantifiable. But I think what Professor Wink does that's really, again, like prescient, is to say, like, at the end of the day, a king is a king. So the question is, how do you swap a kingship for kinship? And this is what the language of the powers is guiding us toward in the New Testament. And I have to say, it's so liberating for me, because having grown up evangelical, we were worried about these red guys and these horns, and we were locked in spiritual warfare and demon possession, when really what the language of the New Testament says, right, is that we're all involved in demonic possession, because a woman earns 90% of a man at best, and that's demonic. And that's the vision of the New Testament, instead of the other stuff that we've kind of put our imagination on, the red guys and like The Exorcist. I guess it could be a both and, but I don't think Professor Wink is saying it's a both and. I think Professor Wink is saying these spiritual forces, and when we talk about spiritual warfare, sadly, like, we settled right into the military metaphor that we're supposed to attack the devil instead of there's a chance for reconciliation and conversion.
Wow. That's pretty good. I like that.
I didn't mean to have the last word, so please don't let me.
Just thought-provoking. It's really, really thought-provoking.
Well, I was kind of interested in his in the way he looks at the book of Romans and Paul. I wasn't quite sure I figured out exactly what he was saying in there.
Is there any particular point you'd throw out to the group, Tim?
How he reconciles the power with the church, I guess.
I don't think it's a full reconciliation, and I can't speak for Professor Wink. Maybe I should be quiet and see if somebody else wants to speak to that. Did anybody have a sense of how the church was caught up in the powers, according to Professor Wink?
Well, there is this paragraph that says, but even the good, when absolute becomes evil, even the best can be perverted by idolatry. For example, the law, the temple, and religion itself.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. I think what Professor Wink would say on my read, right, is that the church has been a force both of liberation and shacklement as well, right? And the question has been not like, should the church have any power, but what power does it convey? I'm afraid to hear what you'd say, but I think I could ask the question of everybody: could you name a time in which the church was caught up in demonic power in your own life? And could you name a time in which the church was caught up in positive angelic power in your own life? And I think probably everybody could answer both of those in like some lovely spirit of gratitude and like, I can't believe you're still here.
That's true. I think I grew up Catholic, and I can think as a Catholic of both sides of the Catholic Church. And that's,
Well, I think that the church still has both sides.
I think that's his diagnosis of power in general, right? And we've been reading Think Through in the lectionary the last several weeks, like David, who I grew up on the flannel board, was
Mhm.
like, had a heart after God's own. God, I hope not. Right? I mean, geez, that's scary. And, you know, you read that story and there's even very little you can empathize with about the guy. I mean, he was a scumbag, like through and through. There's a couple of moments, like last week we read about the death of his son and he's bereft. And like, that's about as good as I can get for the guy. Because, you know, there's not really much else positive that he does, just to be honest, right? And somebody sent me a comment, like in an email, like maybe the guy just fell in love with power. And maybe, like when you look at his life, he kind of did whatever he wanted, hell with the consequences. And they were tough consequences. And I think, right, when you hear about like the Medici Pope, and you know the Inquisition, and it's all easy for us to talk about these things because they happened a long time ago. So like history's come out like shouldn't have done those things. But when we talk about more recent stuff, strangely, like there's controversy around it, which I don't necessarily understand. But that gambit of power in the church obviously still continues, right? And the question is like, do we use power to be lords, or is power meant to raise up people who are having trouble, frankly, feeding themselves and having fundamental dignity? I know that's where Wink's going to go because we read the introduction, right? He was living in war-torn South America. And that's what caused him to do this research. It's like, how can these people be so oppressed?
How did David go from being who he is to being a hero?
It's a great question, Tim. I mean, honestly, like the conjecture goes like, hey, the guy accomplished politically a unification that had not been done before, right? So you essentially had 12 different clans that had very little to do with one another. And then all of a sudden they're united because of him. Remember, Saul didn't do that very well. And he created a capital. And he broke the Torah and built the temple and said God wanted him to do that, right? But people held on to that temple because it was imposed upon them. And then there's this other bit that we do as Christians that our own Jewish brothers and sisters don't do. We read because somebody's in the Bible, they must be emulable unless the Bible says they're a villain. Well, the word villain isn't used for David, but when you read the activities, they're pretty darn villainous. So we made this weird mistake, like he's a hero because the story's about him, instead of here's a cautionary tale. Why we made that mistake, Tim, I don't know, but I know it's a real strong read. If you've ever seen a flannel board in Sunday school, David looks like real cool.
You know, I guess I was thinking about this. Is that God can use all of us, right? And I was actually thinking about this same question myself. It's like, why, even the Star of David, do I feel comfortable? Would I feel comfortable wearing the Star of David? But I've come to the conclusion that none of us will ever be the perfection of God or of Christ. And by even using David with all of his flaws, look what has come out of that, because David is part of the lineage of Christ. And so part of that humanness of Christ takes in all of this other stuff that's part of his history, part of our histories. And so it's hard to, even though we don't like what he did and he's a villain, that goes into, I think it's something you mentioned earlier, like that things become converted. And even those atrocities can become converted into something that God can use for the betterment of creating his kingdom. I did a sermon once and I listed all the villains and pointed out like, which one am I? Because none of us are perfect. an interesting time.
Darlene, you look like you're ready to say something.
Yes, I'm sitting here thinking about how we as people tend to see things in dichotomy, black or white, good or bad. And when we identify a villain, we forget that there are usually some really good, positive human qualities in that person, or there's some reasons they're a villain. Or when we have a hero, it's difficult for us to reconcile the fact that their humanness makes them less than perfect, as you talked about. So I think it's our humanness that tends to see dichotomies that makes us either think of David or other biblical figures or political figures or social figures as being all good or all bad.
Yeah.
Well, I think a very good example of that would be Martin Luther King.
Yes.
Yeah, we struggle with it. And I think we struggle with it, again, we're loath to call somebody a saint till they're dead in case they mess it up later, which is interesting. And like how you hold on to that reality without excusing people's participation in demonic powers, that's a tightrope, right? I mean, and I think it is really important what you're calling out. And like I do think we have sadly this sort of binary tendency where like people love me or they hate me, or people are my friend or they're my enemy, or we have like conducive politics or they're stupid. Like these are the choices that we sadly make, right? And holding on to justice while we also make room for curiosity, right? And empathy, that seems like a pretty big task.
I'm curious, the brand new head of the Space Center is an African-American woman. Perhaps we could have her come over for a talk.
Well, perhaps. Now, I know the closest in I've got is the chief flight director, who's a personal friend of mine. That'd probably be the only way I could make that invitation, but I'll give it a shot.
She might be an Episcopalian, we don't know.
She may be. And Melanie Sanders, who's like the #2 civil servant for NASA, period, right? She lives here, but commutes to DC every week, is a parishioner. So we got a couple ends still. I hate to ask this question. I know the book is a little bit academically inclined. Again, this is the kind of book you would read if you were doing New Testament studies. It's written like this with a million footnotes. I don't always read them, and with all kinds of examples. So you see, he's not just cooking up this idea, he's giving textual analysis. It's going to get easier now. So we've done like the slog, and it's going to get easier. But I just want to ask, is this helpful? The work that he's doing, is it expanding your way of thinking about what the New Testament is pushing us towards?
It's been really helpful to me. Again, I already talked about all these other Enoch, and like I'd never heard of the ascension of Isaiah or anything, but I got the impression that all the battling that's going on in Revelations, or at least some of the cultural stuff that we talk about with good versus evil, we think maybe it just came from Milton, but it's been eye-opening to me that it's from Enoch and all these other Jewish texts that I didn't know about.
That's one of those great things. Remember that every Sunday we read the lectionary, and the lectionary presumes you've read the whole Bible, so you know the context. And many people in church don't, just to be honest, right? It's sort of like we just come on Sundays and we hear the lectionary. So that's part of our Episcopalian heritage. You know, with the gift of being raised Baptist is like you know that story. Now, you know it in some harsh ways, but you know that story, right? And the same thing is true when we read things like the book of Genesis. There's a bunch of invisible sources informing that book that people at the time, I mean, the authors took for granted you knew who the heroes of old were and that they were giants on the face of the earth that were like demigods. We don't believe that stuff. Well, most of us don't. But, you know, again, it influences the way we read the story when we know those other hushed up bits, right? And, you know, the book of James barely made it in the Bible, and the book of Enoch almost made it in the Bible. If you read the book of Enoch, you'll say, thank God that did not make it in the Bible, because it's crazy. I mean, it is so wild. Although, as I mentioned to you, the book of Jude is cut and pasted out of the book of Enoch, word for word. The whole book of Jude comes right out of the book of Enoch. So some of the book was inspired, just not all of it. I mean, that was sort of the decision that was made at Constantinople in 381. I hope that if you've been frustrated with his pacing, that you'll give chapter 4 another go, because again, it's a little bit smoothed out. He's going to talk about interpreting the myth, and that's where we're going to turn next week. And if we need to, we can do another week. But I think we'll essentially finish this book next week and then talk about where we'd like to go. Reminder for you, if you're interested in doing a Bible study on its own instead of through a book, we'll be beginning an extended study of Genesis, Exodus, Luke, and Acts this Wednesday. You don't need to read ahead of Wednesday because we're still gathering materials, right? It takes time for shipping, but we will begin with textual study next week. This is all on Zoom. You can come and go. The workbook is a helpful guide. If you don't get a workbook, that's okay. Join us, that's always fine, but that begins, like I said, on Wednesday at 9 o'clock. And you'll see the e-news will come out early this week. It'll come on Tuesday, and the link will be there. And I keep doing a bad job putting these links in the e-news in a timely, observable way. So I'll repent.
Hey, Mike, I thought you said it was going to start 1 week from Monday.
Well, I lost my mind, Tim. The actual study is like when we start with the text, but this week we'll introduce ourselves and talk about the scope of the study. But you know us, Tim, already, and you won't miss out very much. I used to have a great memory, Tim. I really did. When I was 30, my brain, I was proud of it. And then I don't know what happened. You know, like numbers, I'm good at adding and subtracting, but I keep finding now my memory just does some strange things. And I have to call it junior moments, right? Because I'm not old enough to call it a senior moment, but I'm having these junior moments. And I had one about the dates here.
Well, I found James' voice a lot easier to read than chapter 3.
Well, that's scary. I hope you're not talking about the book Ulysses, because
Yes,
like
I am.
20 people on the planet can read that book. I know Finnegan's Wake. That's the one.
Yeah.
That's
Don't
the
put that in.
yeah.
I couldn't I plowed through Ulysses, but I couldn't handle Finnegan's Wake.
No, I mean he made up the language, right? It's something like 4 sources. It's crazy. Yeah. Hey, thanks everybody for joining us. And really, again, thanks Francene, not only for telling us about the work of the diocese, but for joining us on this book study and how it's related. I'll see you guys in church.